There is a new, but not so new, social phenomenon that people experience, especially across social media or in texting platforms, that is called ghosting. Suddenly and without explanation, someone withdraws communication from you or they avoid personal contact with you. It happens quite frequently in the context of dating or friendships and sometimes even in business contacts. We can think that while the term ghosting is new, the practice is anything but. The practice of ghosting has been going on since the very beginning of creation, because when Adam and Eve had heard the voice of God, their Father, what did they do? They withdrew. They tried to hide themselves, and they did not want to be found by the Lord as God walked in the garden and he said, "Adam, where are you?" And so this practice, it can be because of something trivial or something substantial. It can be the result of the difficulties that we face, and in a non-confrontational culture, and people who tend to want to be Canadian and nice, whatever that means, that we try to avoid confrontation because we find confrontation is uncomfortable, it's awkward, and let's be honest, most of us don't know how to do it well. If we are to be truthful and honest together, I think all of us at some point could say that we have avoided someone, we've avoided contact, we've found it painful and not wanted to address issues, or they're just so complicated that we've just gone, it's easier for me just to withdraw. And yet this is not the way of the Spirit of Christ. That the Spirit of Christ among the family of God is to be fundamentally different. That we are not to conform to the patterns of this world, but we are to be transformed. That we are to think differently, we are to act differently, we are to behave differently. And it's a process for each one of us. That each one of us is in this process of transformation. That we're in a process of being changed from one degree of glory to another. As James writes, he ends his letter in somewhat of a strange way. It's similar in spirit to how 1 John ends. It ends with this appeal for mission. And it's not the typical appeal to mission that most Christians think of in terms of Matthew 28, in terms of going to all the world and making disciples, but it still is the mission of the church. Because James recognizes that a congregation, the congregation that he's writing to, the people of God who have been scattered because of persecution, the people of God who have faced tremendous loss, losing jobs, losing homes, losing family, losing property, losing all sorts of things. They've lost their cultural influence, their cultural position. There can easily become different types of temptations. On the one hand, there can be the temptation that just says, this is too hard. I give up. The persecution isn't worth it. The hardships aren't worth it. I'm done. And on the other hand, there can be the type of attitude that says, I fundamentally disagree with how you're handling things, and you can become strident in your own convictions, thinking that you are right in such a way that you become entrenched, and so entrenched that you become embattled in every controversy. But James makes it clear that when the community of Christ pulls apart, something has to be done. That it's not acceptable in the Church of Jesus Christ to just disappear. I hope and I pray that we as elders and we as a church are working harder and harder to not let people disappear. It does happen on occasion, and for that I'm deeply sorry and I deeply regret it. But the general practice of the community of faith is that when people begin to disappear, there is something that we are called to do. That we are to ensure that there is not a double-mindedness. That we are to ensure that by wisdom and steadfast endurance, as James began this letter, we ensure that people do not wander away from the truth. We need to respond with wisdom in these types of trials. And we need to respond in such a way that that wisdom is patient and loving and gracious. And so this morning, I want to look at these two verses as James ends. And we won't typically we would end James on a Sunday like this, but we'll pick up some themes going on after this week. But I want us to look at how James ends this letter, pulling some of the things together and calling us as the community of faith that when we face trials of many various difficult, hard things and kinds, that we don't pull away from one another, but that we press into one another's lives. And when people are pulling away, what do we do? Three things from James chapter 5, verses 19 and 20. The first thing that we do is that we pursue wanderers. James says this right in verse 19. My brothers, if anyone among you wanders from the truth and someone brings him back, let him know that whoever brings back a sinner from his wandering will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. James here presents, it's hypothetical, if someone, but probably it's been a reality. And just as you and I know, there are people who have wandered away. It happens. We sing about it. We've sung about it in hymns. We sing about it in choruses. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. We know the reality of the wandering nature of our own hearts. And as a result of that, James responds not just with a hypothetical, if anyone among you wanders, but he knows that this has happened, and it does happen. There's been this loss of status. There's been disagreement over how to handle the cultural pressures. There are wavering and wanderings, and there are challenges on every side. And James says that if anyone among you wanders. Now, this word wandering has more than just this sense of let's go for a stroll and see where we end up. The idea here is that wandering has behind it a sense of deception. It started with a little bit of deception, and it's a little bit of deceit. It's a little bit of information that has led someone astray, and they begin to chase after it. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. That people wander all the time because of good things, and good things can cause you to stray. People can lose their focus because, as James writes, as he writes to a congregation who's faced enormous pressure, the loss of status, the loss of culture, the loss of their position, it can be easy to turn towards other things as your means of salvation. That you can look to things like politics, for example, as the means by which you believe you will find your salvation. And in many churches and in many congregations, especially over the last number of years, what has happened? You want to grow a church, you speak against the government, you speak in anti-authoritarian ways, which is not that different from the spirit of the age, to be very honest. But you can get the focus off, even just by a slight bit. And by getting that focus off and by majoring on the minors, you can wander. And James recognizes that there is a compromise that has happened. He says that if anyone among you wanders from what? The truth. Now, in the context of James, when James is speaking about wandering from the truth, he is not necessarily thinking about orthodoxy. He is not saying that someone here has suddenly denied that Jesus Christ is not God and man, fully God and fully man. He is not saying that someone has denied the Trinity. He is not saying that someone is denying that Jesus is the only way of salvation. He's not saying that someone has denied any orthodox truth. In fact, it could very well be that people hold on to the very essential matters of the Christian faith and believe them and have all of their doctrinal ducks in a row. And yet when James is speaking about wandering from the truth, it is about the practice of truth that he is speaking to. We know that because in the context of James chapter 2, he has spoken about how faith without works is dead. That if we do not practice what we say, there is this big gap between what is professed and what is practiced. That is not living in accordance with the truth. And so as a result of that, James says that there is this pattern that happens. And it's this pattern as old as humanity. And here's how wandering happens. You either, on the one hand, get tired and frustrated. You're tired of living the Christian life. It's just getting too hard. Over time, you cease to pray. Maybe then you stop singing because when you gather with the community of faith, there just isn't joy in your heart. And the drift begins. And then it's moving from prayerlessness and a lack of joy in the heart to suddenly drifting so that I pull away. I pull away from other people because I recognize that the pressures are too great. Or it could be that the pressures that are coming against me, I want something, but the community of faith is not responding in the way that I want. And as a result of that, you withdraw. You stop serving in various ways. You step back in various ways. But the deception is so subtle that James can even identify the fact that people can think that they are doing fine because they're wandering. And a wanderer doesn't go, yeah, I'm wandering, right? No one says, yeah, I'm just taking a stroll off and leaving the Christian faith. Don't worry about me, I'll be back. That's not how we wander. We wander because we've been attracted to something else or we've become dissatisfied with what we've been told. And as a result of that, we start to wander. I don't like the direction that this is going. I don't like how this is being handled. I don't like what this is being done. And I can hear it in James' congregation. We've lost our status. We've lost our political stature in the culture. We need to fight back. We need to be more assertive. We need to be more aggressive. And so there were people who were wandering from the truth. And as a result of that, it isn't an active denial of the faith, but it is a subtle deception. And it is slow. It is a slow act of disconnecting. And over time, when you drift, you will find that suddenly the drift is not just a small drift, but a long, long way from home. When I lived up north, I would sometimes go fishing on the Rainy River. And on one occasion, I had gone with a friend of mine who had just purchased a boat, and we were out. We were going to catch some fish. And we had gone up the river as he was trying out his new boat, and the motor died. And I'll tell you, there's nothing quite like being 3 miles from town where you launched the boat and thinking, how on earth are we going to paddle back? And as the boat began to drift and drift and drift, you could just see we were getting further and further and further away from home. That's what it's like to wander. That it's this subtle and slow act of just drifting, and the stream of the world carries you along until suddenly you are at a place that you don't recognize. And it didn't happen intentionally at first. It didn't happen deliberately, but it happened. And James says, if someone has wandered, what do we do? He says, if anyone wanders, someone should bring him back. Do you notice that there's a generic someone? The someone that's to bring them back is any person who is noticing, hey, they're missing. It's not the job of everyone to notify leadership so that leaders always are the ones. There are times, there are cases, there are occasions, but the job and the mission of us as the people of God, every single one of us, is to pursue lost people. No exceptions included. It's your job. If someone who is not here, that you regularly see here, is missing, one of the first things that you can do, the mission of Jesus Christ that he has given to you, is to pick up the phone, send a text, drop by. This is the aim that we have as elders. This is one of the fundamental tasks of the eldership, is to protect the flock, and it's to ensure that we're not letting people just drift. The danger of drifting is so real. We'll talk about what needs to happen, but what do? We We pursue in order to bring them back. This is the language. James is picking up language from the prophets when he says that if someone brings them back, it's the language of repentance. It's the language like of Hosea chapter 3, verse 5, or 6, verse 1, Joel 2, verse 12, where the Lord says, return to me. It is this sense of coming back, bringing someone back, returning them. And Jesus will use this language of pursuing someone and bringing them back several times in the Gospels. In Luke 15, he'll tell 3 stories of how there's a lost coin, there's a lost coin, there's a lost son, there is one other lost thing, sheep. I knew the lost sheep because it's right in my notes. I was wandering from my notes. Jesus mentions these 3 things that are lost, and in each case, the person who has lost that item goes in a diligent pursuit. But more explicitly, in Matthew chapter 18, Jesus says in Matthew 18, beginning in verse 10 and going on through verses 12 and 14, he talks about how if someone has a lost sheep, see there, I remembered it now. If someone has a lost sheep, what do? They leave the 99 and they go in pursuit of the one. And they go and search and find it out in order to bring it back to the fold. And immediately after that, after Jesus says that this is what you do when you've got a lost sheep, you go and pursue it. In Matthew 18, verses 15 and following, Jesus will talk about church discipline, but it's in the context of pursuing. You're to restore the one. If someone has something against you, if someone has sinned against you, you go to them. It is a pursuit of them. It is an active pursuit. It is not passive. It is not going, well, some people get on the bus and some people get off the bus, and that's just the way it is. That's not the Christian faith. That's not how we treat the Church of Jesus Christ. The goal is restoration. And throughout the New Testament, it will give clear examples as to how we're to do this process of restoration. Paul will say, for example, in Galatians 6:1, you who are spiritual should restore someone in a spirit of gentleness. In other words, there isn't a harshness, a beating over the brow. There is this sense of going to someone with tenderness and compassion. Because we know from the New Testament that the way that repentance happens, Romans 2, verse 4, for example, don't you know that it's God's kindness that leads us to repentance? It is not his harshness. It is not his fury, but it is his kindness that leads you to repentance. It's the spirit of 2 Timothy 2, verses 24 through 26, that the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but gentle, able to instruct, so that if some have wandered away, that he might instruct them and bring them back. The process then, in terms of bringing someone back to return them to the fold, is not a quick process of Matthew 18, 1, 2, 3, and you're out. Rather, it is a process of long, diligent, patient suffering with someone else. It is willing to endure hardships to bring them back. It is listening. It is loving. It is restoring. It is ongoing. This sense in which James is speaking about is not just you go to them once and if they're wandering and they don't come back the first time, just let them go. It's that sense of you keep pursuing the sheep. And even if you have a sheep that wanders and it wanders again, you go and pursue it. You pursue it again and you pursue it again and you bring it back. So if the focus then is, this is part of our mission, this is a large part of our mission, is to pursue wanderers, then there's 2 things that happen when we pursue wanderers. And when we are successful, James says in verse 20, let him know that whoever brings back a sinner from his wandering will save his soul from death. Here is one of the aims, that we are This is why we're pursuing people. We're to save them from death. Now, there's a bit of a question. The language here, verse 20, is obscure. And I can't believe it, but I'll qualify this because commentators spend pages on this, even though I think it's ridiculous that they do. It's not clear in verse 20 who is being saved from death and who has their sins covered. So let's ask a question. Do you think it's the person who is pursuing who needs to be saved from death? Or do you think it's the person who's wandering? Wow, I wish you would write commentaries. It seems pretty obvious, doesn't it? It seems obvious by the context that the person whose sins are forgiven, the person who is saved from death, is the one who has just started wandering away from the truth. They've wandered away from life. That's the opposite of death, right? They're wandering away. And as a result of this, the danger is death. And it's not physical death. The reality is spiritual death. This is what God had said to Adam and Eve in the garden, that if they were to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that on that day they would surely die. And Satan had said to them, "Did God really say?" And he made them doubt and question with a subtle deceit. And by getting them to wander, they would take the fruit and they would eat of it, and they would go, "We're not dead." But suddenly their eyes were opened, and they realized they were naked and ashamed, and they were hiding from the Lord. All of the acts, not of moving towards life, but of moving away from it. The reality is that what James is talking about here is spiritual death. And if death is the real threat when you wander, then the goal is to save. And James says that our goal is to save this person from death. That if you bring them back, that's what you do. And James has used the language of saving a couple of times in this letter. In chapter 1, verse 21, he said to receive the implanted word which is able to save your souls. In chapter 2, verse 14, he said that what good is it if you have faith but you do not have works? Is that faith able to save? And in chapter 4, verse 12, he talked about how there is one lawgiver and one judge who is able to save and able to destroy. And in light of that, then what we get is when James talks about saving someone from death, what we are doing is we are calling someone back to receive the implanted word, the word that they received, the word that is able to change them, transform them, to come back to that word for what purpose? That their faith would work, that their faith would have action, that their faith would have legs, so that they would obey the one who has given the commands, the lawgiver, and the one who is to judge. And so just from what James has said about being able to be saved, we can gather together from the book of James that being saved from death is calling someone back to return to life, to return to receiving the word, to return to obedience, to return to trusting themselves to the God who knows what is good and right and who gives his commands. Now, ultimately, we know that it is the Lord who saves. It's not you and me. As wonderful as you can be, it is the Lord who ultimately will save a person. But he has given you a mission. And the mission he has given to you is to be eyes wide open and looking for people who are wandering, watching out. Paul will talk about watching over one another in love. And so we are saving people from death by bringing them back, by going and pursuing, doing it with kindness and gentleness and patience. But the second thing that James says that will happen when we pursue a sinner and we bring them back is that we cover their sins. Now, this language of covering sins, it's not exactly clear. We know from other contexts and other places in the Bible what it means to cover. But if you were just to read this here, to cover sins, you need to get some clarity as to what it is and what it isn't. What is it not? It's not covering up. To cover up, we all use this expression, to cover up is to hide something, it's to conceal something. And David will contrast covering up with covering over in Psalm 32. He will say, "Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sin is covered. When I kept silent, my bones wasted away." There he was covering up his sins, but when I acknowledged my sin to the Lord, then he forgave me. He parallels in that opening verse of Psalm 32, "Blessed is the man whose sins are forgiven, whose transgressions are covered." There's the parallel. To have transgressions covered is to have sins forgiven. So it's not covering up, it's not hiding, it's bringing them out into the open, it's having them exposed, but then in having them exposed, not just having them exposed for the sake of voyeurism, but to show that God is gracious to forgive those who confess. Or we can hear the echoes of Proverbs. James has turned to Proverbs before, and in Proverbs 10, verse 12, it says that hatred stirs up strife, but love covers sin. And there we get the contrast. That what happens is when you're pursuing sin, it is stirring up trouble. It is hatred. But love, what it does is it covers over it. Now, we could think of this in another way to just get further clarification. If you have, let's say you have enormous credit card debt, and you're trying to figure out a way to survive because the bank is calling and you're struggling to make payments, and this is a plug for Paul's seminar on Saturday. And you don't have to be in this position to go on Saturday either. If you were to go and get another credit card to pay off your credit card, that's not covering your expenses. That's just dealing with a problem by creating another problem, or by getting a line of credit, or by refinancing. Now, Paul will give you great tips in terms of how we can deal with debt in biblical ways. But that's not covering. But if someone comes to you and says, "I know a multitude of sins," it's not just a little bit of sin, it's that there is this deep debt because the drift has been long, the drift has been far, and what does God in His grace do? He gives you a payment that covers all of your debt, that wipes your account from the negatives back to zero so that you no longer are in debt. But He does more than just cover debt. He then gives you access to His account, which you suddenly discover is full of great wealth. And this is the benefit of bringing a wandering soul back. You save them from death, and you cover over a multitude of sins. You see, this is our mission. Peter will talk about this in 1 Peter 4, verse 8, that it's love that covers over a multitude of sins. If hatred stirs up strife, but love covers sins, as Solomon can say in Proverbs 10:12, then what is the mission that we have been given? The mission that you and I have been given is the mission that the Lord Jesus was given. It is exactly the same. It is that the Lord Jesus, when He saw us wandering from the fold of God, Isaiah would say this, "We all like sheep have gone astray. Each one of us has turned to his own way." Every single person in this room at some point has wandered. We all were born with wandering feet. And when we profess faith in Jesus Christ, part of our function, part of our mission as the community of Jesus Christ is to watch over one another in love. We go after people. But how do we go after people? We keep pressing into their lives with patience and gentleness, with kindness and with listening, with long-suffering, because when God sent His one and only Son, you were a rebel. You did not love Him. You did not want Him. In fact, it was you and me who nailed the Lord of glory to the cross. He endured the sufferings of the cross because he knew the reward of rescuing a soul. He pursued us unto death. So it should not be a surprise that when we go after people, that they will say hard things, hurtful things, and do things that might inflict wounds upon us. The person who pursues loves so deeply that they are willing to have those wounds inflicted on them because the Lord Jesus had your wounds inflicted upon him. He pursued you to the point of death. And if he pursued you to the point of death, then we pursue others with the same kind of vigor and passion and energy, and we pray that the Lord gives us strength to love one another so deeply from the heart that we might love as Christ loved. That's what it looks like. That when we disagree, there are times for disagreements, and disagreements aren't bad, they have their place. But when it begins to cause the community to pull apart, when the church of Jesus Christ has people who are wandering, church, brothers and sisters, you have a mission. And maybe right now the Lord has put upon your heart, there is someone who is wandering. And you're thinking about them. If God has put someone on your heart, it's not your responsibility to delegate that to someone else. It's that God has put them on your heart because he has put a burden of love in your heart for that person. So pursue them. Find out what's going on in their life. Be interested in them. Love them. Be kind. Expect that there might be harshness or there might be pain. Expect that the nails that crucified Jesus might also pierce your soul too. But know this, that when you go after someone and you bring them back, there is rejoicing in heaven. There is delight that God has. That when you do that and you bring a soul back, a sinner from his wandering, you save them from death and you cover over a multitude of sins. So, Lord, we pray, help us not to lose track of people in our lives and as part of our church family. Help us to be patient and not to be quick. Lord, I'm thankful for our elders and how this is something that they have taken seriously to do. And I pray that as our elders aim to do this, that we also as a church family would do this. We'd love one another so deeply. We're not aiming, Lord, to build a bigger organization, but we are aiming to present each man and woman blameless before your throne of grace on that final day. And you have given us this task and this responsibility to love one another deeply. So help us, I pray, for the person that you've put on our heart and mind, even this morning. Now give us courage to do something. A phone call, a text, an email, a request to visit, that you would give us that kind of courage and boldness, I pray, so that we might represent Jesus just as he came and rescued us from sin and death. We thank you for your great love that now empowers us to be your servants on your mission, which we ask that you would send us out in Jesus' name.